Hello to everyone. So, as Ali just mentioned, my name is Nick. I'm a senior solutions engineer here with Basis Technology. And that means, just as Ali said, that I spend a lot of the time in the field, talking to our clients, discussing the challenges they're trying to solve. And our topic today is actually inspired by a conversation I had really not that long ago, I think 2 or 3 weeks, where a client said to me, hey, we're interested in doing some social media based analytics, but we're not really sure how to start. And we know NLP fits into this, but I'd love it if you could give me a little bit more of a breakdown. And so the talk we're going to have today, the stuff I'm going to discuss, the things I'm going to show you are all inspired by that concept of how do we inject some advanced techniques into social media triage. Okay, sound good? Let's go ahead and get started. Now, the last thing I will say before we dive into this is that please, please, please use the question box. It's one of the reasons I'm here doing this live. One of the reasons we didn't choose to record this is because I want to be able to work with you one-on-one if necessary to work through any questions you might have. So definitely, if something comes up, throw them in that question box. All right, good deal? Cool. Let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to do really briefly is just talk about what we mean when we say triage, right? Now, funnily enough, triage is actually originally a medical-based term. There was something called a triage nurse whose job it was to survey a group of patients, potentially a really large group of patients, and quickly determine who needs medical attention the most so that the limited resource, i.e. the doctors or the physicians, were spending their time on the people who are in most need. Now, obviously, the idea of triage has really expanded since then, and it's become a more general term that refers to determining from within a group what the most important things are. Now, why would we triage it all? What's the point of this? Well, it's pretty self-explanatory. The idea is that we have limited time. We do not exist in a world of infinite resources, which means we need to be able to figure out quickly what matters most to us. In the world of social media analytics, this is especially important because it's been referred to as like a fire hose. You could drown in the amount of data, text data, that lives in the world of social media. So you need to be able to prioritize. That's the end goal here. We have a limited amount of time, a limited amount of resources. We need to really quickly take a view of what's present in the social media space so that we can determine what the most important next steps are. Okay. Interesting, but why would we be examining social media at all? What's the point? Well, the specific point I was discussing was actually in a marketing related firm, and they wanted to survey social media so that they could understand how well their new ad campaigns were doing. That's a super common use case. Another one in a similar vein, a bit more sneaky, is saying, okay, instead of examining our responses, instead of examining how the clients or the world at large responds to our ad campaigns, how are they responding to our opponents' new ad campaigns? So there's a lot of different stuff you can do here, but it all begins from getting an accurate understanding of what is available to you and what the data is actually saying so that you can do more advanced stuff. So moving past that, if we've convinced ourselves that yes, we want to examine the world of social media, yes, triage is an important part of this, then there becomes the next logical question, which is cool, but why do I want to use natural language processing for any of this? Well, natural language processing really goes hand in hand whenever you're trying to perform triage on text-based data. Modern natural language processing tools are going to let you really, really quickly dive in and get an understanding of what a huge amount of text data is trying to tell you. And with a little bit of effort, this can even be fully automated. So you're slowly removing the number of humans in the loop and reserving human time for tasks that require human levels of intelligence, right? Okay, fascinating. But what would we actually be doing with NLP as part of this process? Well, generally speaking, when it comes to triaging large amounts of text data, in this case, social media data, you're going to be trying to attempt two different things. The first thing you're going to try to do is you're going to try to make sure that whatever information is stored in these documents can be retrieved from an index at a later date, an index or a database. That means you need to prep these documents for searching, and that takes the form of a lot of foundational NLP processes, a lot of morphological analysis, which I'm going to dive into in a moment. Then once you've got that done, once you've laid the groundwork, so to speak, you can begin to do more advanced stuff, and you can begin to find within the document relevant information, which you can then tag as metadata. So this is not the same thing as doing base analysis. This is actually going above and beyond, because you're essentially creating essentially a list of quick important information that you're going to stamp to that data, so that whenever it's reviewed at a later date, you don't need to, say, read the whole thing to quickly get the gist or understand what's important about that given document. Okay, so what happens once you've done both of those things? Once you've gone in and you've done that base analysis so you can find these later, once you've tagged the document with all the important bits of information you want to be tagged to it, what is this going to let us do? Well, at a high level, this is actually going to let us draw deeper insights. Again, once you understand what's present within your data, you can start seeing how all the bits and pieces of data you have are connected. In the world of social media, this is an important step, because if you imagine Twitter specifically, you'd think about the fact that a lot of these tweets are essentially forming chains. Somebody puts out a tweet, and then 3 people respond to that, and then 6 people respond to the responses, and eventually you've got yourself this huge network. Once you get an understanding of what the tweets are discovering, you can begin to connect tweets not only in that very basic who replied to whom framework, but also on the basis of content and what's actually being discussed. Okay, so that's why we might use natural language processing as part of this task, but it's not really all sunshine and roses, because even though NLP is a natural fit for this type of problem, social media-based text specifically has a bunch of things, a bunch of challenges that go with it that can make traditional analysis techniques that don't leverage AI really struggle. And essentially what it comes down to is what you and I already know, which is a lot of the times language is used, what's a polite way to phrase this, loosely on social media networks. So you're going to be dealing with a lot of unproofread text and a lot of non-standard, or if you're unlucky, essentially non-existent syntax and grammar. So those two things specifically really give rules-based analysis techniques a hard time, because there's nothing a rules-based system likes more than to be dealing with content that is itself ordered and following rules. When you start throwing curveballs at it in the form of bad grammar or misspelled words, all of a sudden those rules and lists can kind of start to collapse under their own weight. That's one of the benefits of using statistical-based approaches to this stuff, or an AI-based approach to this stuff, because the flexibility to handle misspellings or potentially bad grammar is essentially baked into the analysis process. Okay, so that's fascinating. It's clear that social media specifically wants a more flexible approach, but that doesn't mean that AI is some kind of magic bullet, because there are still things that can give it a hard time. And specifically in the world of social media, that's going to be stuff like short text strings. It's the nature of statistical-based, really anything, but in this case, statistical-based analysis, that it wants as much data as it can get its hands on. Unfortunately, especially in the world of Twitter, you could be dealing with a text document that is 2 words long or 1 word long, maybe even 1 or 2 characters only, and that's going to be a real challenge. If you are in the process of building out an NLP pipeline, really of any kind, because this isn't necessarily unique to social media, make sure you evaluate its performance on very small amounts of text, because you may want to develop discrete techniques for handling that blind spot, if it is in fact a blind spot in your current approach. Okay, so that's kind of the end of the slide portion of this. We took a look at what triage even means, why it's important, especially when it comes to doing social media-based analytics, and then we talked a little bit about the value NLP can bring, as well as the challenges that you're going to need to overcome, especially when it comes to social media-based data. So what we're going to go ahead and do now is we're going to pivot. We're going to take a look at some real documents used loosely, pulled from social media, and we're going to see all the different ways these can be analyzed using NLP tools, as well as discuss why we might want to analyze the documents in this fashion. So what I'm going to use to do this is this guy right here. So this is called discovery, and let's talk about it for a second. So in the quote unquote real world, where you're actually building these NLP pipelines, a lot of the work you're going to be doing is going to live right there at the code level. because you're going to be working with a lot of data and complex processes, and you're not going to want a nice UI for everything. Some stuff you're just going to be another link in the chain. And that's great. And that's where basis technology tools live, at the code level with Java libraries and the like. However, that does not make it very easy to understand what's actually happening. And that's the point of discovery. This is going to make it easy for you and I to look at a given document and get an understanding of what we can actually find in that document, or what can actually be done to that document using NLP approaches. So the documents we're going to be looking at today, as I mentioned before, are stuff pulled from the social media universe at large. And we're going to start by taking a look at this tweet right here. This is it. Again, only a sentence long. And as a human, just reading this without any fancy special approaches, we can kind of get an understanding of what's happening here. It's talking about Scarlett Johansson attending apparently the premiere of Avengers Endgame, it looks like. That's awesome. But again, we don't have the time to use a human to analyze all of these things. It would take forever, potentially even literally forever, for a human being to keep up to date with all of the tweets being produced. So we're going to do some NLP approaches, and we're going to start by making sure that if I want to get access to this tweet later on, that I'm going to be able to find it successfully. And that story begins with more foundational NLP processes. And I'm specifically going to talk about lemmatization here. So what you're seeing now is two variants of this same tweet. In black, up top is the original version, and then beneath it in blue, we've gone through and we've lemmatized all of the words present here. Now, some of you may be very familiar with the idea of lemmatization, and some of you may not have heard this word before. So a very brief overview. Lemmatization is essentially the act of going through and analyzing all of the words in a given sentence and reducing them down to their dictionary form. So the way that word would be represented in the dictionary. Now, that sounds trivially easy at first, right? Just go in, find the prefixes, find the suffixes, chop them off, and you're good. That's not necessarily the case though, because sometimes part of the process is going to involve making sure that you're using the word in the proper tense. So not past tense or future tense, but present tense. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say you tell a lemmatization tool to lemmatize the word spoke. Well, if you were taking a naive approach, you'd look at spoke and maybe you'd say, spoke, like a bicycle spoke. Yeah, that's in the lemmatized form, we're good. But maybe by examining the surrounding context, you learn that we're actually talking about a conversation that happened in the past. And that reference of spoke is actually a variant of the word speak. Well, you're going to want to go in there and you're going to want to make sure that in your database, you understand that the word speak is one of the words present. Okay, fascinating, but why? Why do I care about any of this? Well, we care about this because when we go in later and we search for one of these documents and we type in the word attend, for instance, what we don't want to have happen is miss the document because the document said attended, for instance. That's one example, but there's many, many more. This is part of that foundational approach I was discussing earlier, where you go in and you make sure later on we can find these documents, and lemmatization is a very important part of that process. Now, the next thing we're going to be taking a look at is more along the lines of actual metadata generation and extraction, right? And in the world of NLP, when we're talking about pulling information out of a given document, the word of the day is entities, and specifically entity extraction. Now, to take a look at entity extraction capabilities, we're actually going to look at a slightly different document because social media does not just contain tweets that you find out on Twitter. Sometimes you're going to be looking at much longer form bits of text, the type of stuff you might see on Facebook, for example. Let's go ahead and take a look at something like that. So this is a Facebook post I stole from my aunt's page. The names have been changed to protect the innocent, so don't go try and hunt it down. So again, this is what a human sees when we look at this, but we tell an NLP tool to go through this and find me all the important people, places, and things. You get something like this back. You can see it went in and figured, okay, John's a person, Google's a company, Amazon's a company, et cetera, et cetera. This is all useful and this is all informative data because now if we ever want to find Andy again in our mountain of documents, we can immediately tell that this document mentions him. However, there's actually more at play here than just that. I want to point something out to you. So we see this reference to John right here, and we can see this little number 2 next to his name, which is the tool coming back and telling us, hey, I found John twice. But we quickly comb over this, Andy, Ali, Charlie. Wait a minute, John's only here once. What's the story? Well, our tool did a little trick called pronomial resolution, where it went through and it identified that this he reference right here is actually talking about John. This capability to go in and find the he's, the she's, the it's, and the they's and tie them back to real people is going to be super important when you're analyzing social media, because a lot of social media documents are written from the first person, and they're going to include a lot of these he's and she's and it's and they's. So that's fascinating, and that's one example of metadata creation or metadata discovery almost within a document. But what if we take it another step further, right? What if we go in and we say, all right, I'm not just interested in what entities are present in a given document, but we also want to determine how these entities relate to each other. So let's flip this back really quick. Let's look at this sentence here. Charlie, my eldest, has been working at Google for a while now. So you and I would understand that that's telling us about a relationship. It's saying that Charlie works at Google, which is above and beyond anything entity extraction can give you. Well, one of the additional tools that we created relatively recently is called relationships. And its whole purpose in life is to suss out this exact type of thing from text. And so if I flip over here to the relationships tab and say, hey, Discovery, show me all the relationships you found, it's going to immediately turn around and say, hey, you know what? I got one. I found that Charlie is an employee or member of Google, which is exactly the level of additional insight you want. Now, from an understanding perspective, you don't need to read this whole document. You can quickly say, all right, it's got these people mentioned in it, and that it also tells us that Charlie works at Google. This is what we're talking about when we're saying tag the document with additional metadata. It's really not enough just to go in and do those foundational steps where you lematize it. That should be considered like the bare minimum, because while yes, you've now prepped that document so that you can quickly retrieve it from whatever index you go with, it's not enough to get a good bird's eye view of a huge group of documents. And metadata creation, like we discussed here, is. Okay, so moving past that point, right, let's talk a little bit more about some of the additional things you can do potentially once you've got all this information at your fingertips. One of the more common desires, or one of really the more common approaches when it comes to getting an understanding of a huge amount of data, is visualization. Let's throw this up on screen and take a look at it represented in a different way. And perhaps that'll give us a better understanding of how things tie together. So one of the things I can do here, just using this document, is I can actually represent all of the entities within this document visually. And we can go in and we can say, hey, show me all of the different relationships tied to this specific document. Again, this visualization, what you're seeing on screen here, which is functionally just a bit of JavaScript, is only something you can do if you've done all of the steps leading up to this point. You can't find entities and relationships unless you've gone in and done the base NLP stuff. And you can't generate neat visualizations, which can be very useful when you're doing an investigative approach, unless you know the entities and relationships present. So this is very much essentially layers of NLP built on top of each other, with the more foundational stuff creating the foundation, go figure, and the more advanced stuff sitting on top of the work that's already been done. Cool. So a quick look at the clock says we've only got about 10 minutes left. I'm looking at the question box though, and I'm not actually seeing anything. So if you've got questions, now is the time. But since I'm loath to just waste 10 minutes with dead air, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the additional things you might be able to find within a document. So pivoting back to this guy right here. So again, this is my social media post, and we've talked about how we can go in and we can find the different entities. We've talked about how it's very important to make sure that you lematize things successfully to pull information out. But what if we wanted to get a better understanding of not just what is being mentioned literally within a document, so not just a list of Charlies and Googles and whatnot, but actually a better understanding of what the document's discussing. Well, there is a concept, or really a field within NLP that's referred to as topic modeling. And well, it can mean many things, but in this context, we're going to use it to mean being able to analyze a given bit of document and get an understanding of what that document's actually talking about, what is being discussed, even if it's not being mentioned verbatim. So for instance, if we hop in here, we can see that we've got a number of different key phrases pulled out and then a couple of different concepts extracted. Now, as you can see, the concepts we're seeing here are not especially useful, which feeds back into the earlier conversation about how the more text you can provide in a given document, the better. That said, that doesn't mean that concept modeling is necessarily useless. And a more rich data set on a larger or perhaps even a more contentful piece of text, you'd be able to pull out a lot of salient information that you can then tag. What's the upshot of all of this? Well, imagine you're performing an investigation. You are that marketing agency, and you have kind of scooped up all of Twitter and Facebook. You figured out every bit of text that mentions your new ad campaign or your new product, and you want to see what's being said. Well, now that you've done all of these steps, instead of just kind of opening things at random and seeing what they contain and maybe tagging it yourself, you can drill right in and you can say, actually, please only show me the documents or the tweets, for example, that were generated about our product that were issued by a female that talk about this specific aspect of the tool, maybe how it relates to, I don't know, battery life, for instance, or maximum range. And on top of that, I also am really only interested in the tweets that compare our product to another's. So also make sure that when you're returning documents, they also include a mention to one of our competitors of your choosing. That's a level of insight that you can only get with a robust NLP approach. And it's the upside where you can now quickly see what you've got and figure out what you know now so that you can make important decisions, or figure out what you're going to do next, that you're essentially empowered to make these kinds of judgment calls without requiring a massive time investment up front, because everything you've seen up to this point in this little demonstration can all be automated. You don't need a human for any of this. They can simply review what the output is. Awesome. So we've got about 5 minutes left. I'm still not seeing any questions, and I think I've shown you enough of what I wanted to get across in today's webinar. So at this point, I know Ali's got a few statements she wants to make before we wrap.
Sorry, Nick, there actually are 2 questions that came in.
I am not getting an updated question box. Thank you for letting me know, Ali.
Yeah, I might have to switch around the settings for that. So I apologize. I did think that you would be able to see them. These just came in though. So let me just make this a little bit bigger. How can Rosette Discovery be integrated with other systems?
Excellent. So that's an interesting question. So Discovery itself is really meant as a demonstration tool. It's simply visualizing processes and steps that were undertaken at the code level. So if you specifically want to integrate Discovery into another system, that's a larger conversation. But if your question is simply, how do I take all this information we've discussed and channel it into a tool of my design? Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. On the topic of our tools, because we output the results of our analysis in this really easily analyzed format, traditionally it's JSON, it really requires very little coding effort to take our output and turn it into an input that's useful to your tool. And it may even work right out of the gate. With Discovery, it's more complicated because this is technically connected to a discrete database. But hey, if you're looking at this right now and you're saying, I actually just want that tool right there, definitely reach out to us, because that's a fascinating conversation and I'd love to help you with it. Ali, you got one more for me?
Great. Yep. And another one just came in as well. So how do you get the metadata around demographics? So male, female, age, location, etc.
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question. So what we've discussed up to this point has really only been focused on taking information that you can find just within the body of the text. So this right here, kind of ignoring all of the other information that you'd be able to extract if you were combing Twitter. So you've got 2 options here, right? The option A is get absolutely everything you possibly can out of a document just using what it contains. Option B is make use of the information that's going to be available when you pull it down off of Twitter itself. And that kind of skirts the question. I can appreciate that. But realistically speaking, that type of information, if it's not present in the body of the document, is going to need to be found elsewhere. And I know that a lot of the time, when you pull down information from Twitter, you get username information and the like that may be useful for that kind of modeling. So a partial answer. I wish I could give you more, but we're limited in the world of NLP to working with what they gave us.
Great. And how does the API/connector work? We will need to provide social media logins, etc.
Yes, so that's another good question that's getting really more into the specifics of pulling data from Twitter itself, which I will openly admit that I'm not an expert on. What I do know is that Twitter has, or used to have, a fire hose where you could essentially get access to raw tweet data as it's generated, which you can then pull down. I think that's changed recently. I think that they've got a new agreement that says that you can, for research purposes, pull tweets down, but there's, I think, a daily limit of like 50,000 tweets. So unfortunately, I don't have a complete answer for that. That's something that you're going to need to research on your own. But thankfully, pulling tweets down for research purposes is a really, really common task. So it's almost certainly a solved problem.
Great. Okay, so thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We hope you learned something and found this useful. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to communicate with you. As mentioned a few times already, there is a super quick survey that should take you less than a minute to fill out. So we'd really appreciate it if you'd let us know what we did well and what we could do better. And if you did enjoy this, we'd love to have you check out our other upcoming webinars, all of which you can check out at basistech.com/events. So thanks, everybody. Stay safe and healthy out there, and we hope to see you again on the next one. Have a great
Take
rest
it
of your
easy,
day.
everybody. See you soon.